Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here again. Here at the Gay Street Studios. Looks like a really beautiful late afternoon out today. It's beautiful Thursday afternoon. Hope you're enjoying these as much as I am enjoying making them. And we start with Wallace Stevens today, the great, eminent modernist poet, Wallace Stevens, who I think will challenge us in some very fun and very memorable ways. Stevens was born in 1879, so that just to place it in context, pardon me, that's 20 years older than Hemingway. So he's really of a different generation than Hemingway, and roughly the same as Gertrude Stein. So he's one of the older of these individuals, all of whom are practicing their art, as you know, at more or less the same time, and coming to prominence at more or less the same time. Just as an example, I'll talk about this later, but Stevens' first work, first book, first collection, it's called Harmonium, very famous and important work, 1923. So that puts us, Ulysses at 1920, Ulysses at 1922, Wasteland 1922, Harmonium 1923. What are we? Gatsby 1925. Sun Also Rises 1926. So we're right in that same area. So he's born in 1879, lives to 1955. He's born in Reading, Pennsylvania. Pardon me. So he actually knows the early American imagists. He knows them personally. He knows William Carlos Williams, whose poetry, sadly, we just don't have time to get to this term that I hope you get to with our great teacher of American poetry, Dr. Miriam Clark. Sign up for Dr. Miriam Clark's class if you'd enjoy a more expansive look at poetry in particular, poetry of this period in particular. So Stevens knew Williams, he knew H.D., Hilda Doolittle, and he knew Pound. Now he did not follow Imagist principles slavishly, but he very much partook of that kind of, shall we say, that energy, that kind of intellectual and artistic energy that was generated by that Imagist group, by Pound, H.D., and William Carlos Williams, and Stevens, in Pennsylvania, at Penn at the time. And he went to Harvard, in 1897, and stayed for 3 years at Harvard. And after he graduates from Harvard, he goes to New York City to try his hand at journalism. But eventually, his father keeps grinding him down, wants him to go to law school. So he goes to law school, and he achieves the bar. He passes the bar in 1904. And upon receiving his JD, he begins working as counsel, as sort of counsel, as sort of the in-house lawyer, or one of the in-house lawyers for the Hartford Insurance Company, which back then was a huge ongoing concern, and as far as I know, still is today. And he works there from 1916 for the rest of his life. He was a very rich man. He was a white collar business executive, an attorney, Harvard educated attorney, making loads of dollars in the insurance industry. And during this whole time, sitting behind this huge, beautiful desk in a huge, beautiful office in the Hartford Insurance Company, writing some of the most intellectually and spiritually and linguistically adventurous poetry ever produced by an American. And it just goes to show, you can do what your mom wants you to, you can do what your dad wants you to, you can get rich, you can make the whole stock exchange your own, as Robert Frost says. So no man can call you crone. You can do all that and still be a great artist. It's just a wonderful case. Okay, so just in terms of his output, Harmonium, as I said, 1923, and then very significant, I can't name them all, just the significant ones. Ideas of Order, which is 1935, still still in the heart of the modernist movement, 1935. And then he publishes a kind of a poem slash essay called Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction in 1942. These are, and then he publishes the Necessary Angel, again, an essay shot through with poetry, publishes that in 1951. All very important works in the developing poetics of America, well, in the development of American poetics in the early to middle of the 20th century. And we'll talk more about this, but you'll see in Stevens some of the following themes. He's interested in the nature of reality, and the imagination, and the relationship between the two. Right? The nature of reality and the imagination and the relation between the two. Pardon me, allergies. Those two categories, if you will, are never seen by Stevens as separate. They belong to one another, reality and the human imagination. In other words, subjectivity and objectivity, the self and the world. We recognize some of these themes, don't we? Because they go all the way back to Picasso, right? And before. So it's interesting. I love this time in the class, in the course, because you can see the way these ideas are kind of expanding and breathing in and taking on new life with each practitioner, right? And you can see these practitioners they're philosophers in a way, they're theorists in a way, they're critics in a way, as well as artists. And there's that constant, we've talked about this before, that constant intramural, intersubjective interplay between what theory is and what art is, what philosophy is, and what artistic practice is. And they belong to one another and they partake of one another, never more intimately as in the modernist period. And I would argue that there's still that relation between the two is still under inquiry, still under exploration, still under examination by our artists who are working today. And we err when we separate theory from art. They are one another. They belong to one another. Okay, even though our academic disciplines want to break them up. Okay, another theme you'll see in Stevens. I'm sorry, it's allergies. He's interested in exploring the sources of human meaning. In other words, what makes the world what makes our lives meaningful to us comes from. How meaning is generated. He's interested also in exploring the tension between conventional and alternative spiritualities. Interested in exploring the tension between conventional and alternative spiritualities. And we'll talk to a great, we'll give a lot of attention to that. We'll talk about that to a great degree. Okay, just in terms of his language, Stevens plays his way elegantly into complex ideas. He uses the frivolous to get to the crucial. He uses the playful to get to the profound. He uses elegance to get to the fundamental. His poems, through wit, achieve earnestness. His poems, through teasing, approach the absolute. And you're not going to find anything particularly dramatic. And then I'm using that word in Pound and Eliot's sense of the term, right? Stevens's poetry is not, it's not a poetry of personae in the same way that Eliot's and Pound's are, right? And you'll see that there's nothing dramatic in that technical terms. Rather, what you see in Stevens are philosophical this is important now, philosophical propositions rendered in graphic, almost painterly designs, nearly void of quote unquote naturalistic detail. Let me just give that to you again. What you see in Stevens are philosophical propositions. Every poem, a philosophical proposition, an idea about human meaning, in other words, right? They're epistemological investigations. They're ontological investigations. They explore the relation between ontology and epistemology. For my money, like no other American poet has. Very powerful, very exciting, very intellectually invigorating. So philosophical propositions rendered in graphic, almost painterly designs, nearly void of quote unquote naturalistic detail. In this way, y'all, for me, he reminds me very much of Matisse. That is, the poems can sometimes seem flat. You look at a poem like J. Alfred Prufrock, it's a very deep exploration of character, right? It's very rich. It's very, it's very nuanced. Stevens, there's a certain flatness, but in that flatness, as with Matisse, that flatness is very rich in primary color, very rich in its juxtapositions, very rich in its memorable quality, very rich in the ways in which it grabs you aesthetically. Something very painterly, I think. I'm not the first to notice this, but I think it's a very accurate insight. His language, you could say, is characterized by a deviant precision, So we encounter bizarre, eccentric phrasing. I personally love it. But you see language used and phrasing, the actual lexical choices, and then the phrasing, deploying those individual lexical choices, used in ways you've never seen it used before, in ways that are sometimes quite obtuse, sometimes quite obscure, but that always work in the end, that always can be assembled and viewed together as a aesthetic whole and a semantic whole and a semiotic whole, right? There's an integrity, despite this kind of obtuseness, this occasional, this sort of this grammar and lexical choices that seem awry, slightly off. In the end, they serve a very profound integrity in every poem. Very, very exciting. So bizarre, eccentric phrasing, comparisons and juxtapositions that achieve a memorable intellectual and emotional clarity. Yeah. Let me just read you a couple of quotes that I think orient us towards Stevens very vividly as an intellect and as a poet. Yeah. Check these out. After one has abandoned a belief in God, poetry is that essence which takes its place as life's redemption. After one has abandoned the belief in God, poetry is that essence which takes its place as life's redemption. So there is a scriptural quality in Stevens. He's asserting the truths, he's asserting the spiritual insights of a kind of alternative spiritual condition, an alternative spiritual apparatus. And it's an apparatus whose truths are disclosed via the human agency of art. Very powerful. And he's in dialogue as an artist and as a thinker, as a soul, in dialogue as an artist, as a thinker, and a soul with conventional spiritual traditions, always. And I think that's very exciting about Stevens. It's as though he's pushing us to the next dimension of spiritual meaning, one that we're just on the liminal edge of, right? Still functions in that way. And he's very playful there, but also very profound in examining the relation between conventional spiritual traditions and this new vision of how eternal meaning can come to us. So, he's after Moby Dick. I mean, he's after the big fish here. He's Ahab, he's Queequeg, he's Ishmael. He's after the big one, and he's taking us with him. What you got to love about Stevens is he didn't lose one of his legs. He's got both of them. and we can keep both of our legs as well, alluding to Moby Dick. Okay, let me give you another quote from Stevens. One reads poetry with one's nerves. One reads poetry with one's nerves. So think of what he's saying there through what he's not saying. Excuse me. He's not saying one reads poetry through one's intellect. He's not saying one reads poetry through one's emotional constitution. He uses the word nerves, which has a biological side, doesn't it? In other words, poetry is something that happens to us. It's not something we think about, and it's not something we feel. It occurs to us. I love that usage. It occurs to us. It engages our humanity on the level of the biological. Give me another one. Aristotle is a skeleton. Aristotle is a skeleton. Love that as well. A skeleton. Two meanings. A skeleton as in a structure that we can make use of, an armature that we can make use of to give structure to our meanings, right? To give structure to our modes of order. The mode of order that gives structure to our own modes of order that we stack upon it. Skeleton in that sense, but also he's dead. Let me give you one last one. It's my favorite one. Well, my favorite. One of my favorites. Poetry must resist the intelligence almost successfully. Poetry must resist the intelligence almost successfully. So ultimately, poetry must give itself to our intellects so that we can comprehend. Yeah. But it has to address the other dimensions of our humanity with just as much force. And I think you'll see that force, that combination of forces, that combination of vectors, that combination of factors that Stevens deploys to reach us, right? To make that link between his words on the page and our human consciousness, which of course is composed of more than the intellect. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Let's take a look very quickly at just by way of introduction at the poem "Anecdote of the Jar." I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I think it's a very instructive example of how Stevens works. I'm doing on time here. Okay. Anecdote of the Jar. Everybody have it? Anecdote of the Jar. Now notice, just look first at the title, Anecdote of the Jar. First of all, anecdote of the jar? What can possibly, how can a jar produce an anecdote of any type? You know, what can possibly be happening, that's worthy of our attention, right? What little narrative, what little episode, what little anecdote can a jar produce? Well, the anecdote takes place here and takes place here. The anecdote is generated magically in our subjective relationship to the language on the page. That's the anecdote. That's where it happens. That's where whatever happens on this hill happens. Here and here. Poetry must be read with the nerves. Now, also I should say a jar. Now, don't think of this as a mayonnaise jar. This is not a Skippy peanut butter jar. It's not glass with a tin top, right? Think of it as an urn, or in other words, an example of primitive pottery. Kind of, you think the urn. Remember we talked about Sybil at Cumai and what she sat in, like that level of jar. Think about an ancient jar, pottery, right? In other words, kind of step one of civilization, step one of the human art. We need something to carry our water. We need something to put this grain in. We need something to put this rice in, something we can put a lid on. Let's learn to shape this clay and fire this clay so that it contains what we need it to contain humanly at the most elemental level of survival, right? So it's kind of it's humankind's first effort, symbolically speaking. Give me a little symbolic room here. But metaphorically speaking, it's our humanity's first effort at producing culture. It's the first instance, symbolically speaking, of the production of culture. It's the archetypic artifact. That's good. It's the archetypic artifact. Usually, when something's written down, it's usually a good thing. It's the archetypic artifact. It's the elemental aesthetic product, right? The first vessel made to satisfy human need. Okay, so that's the jar. That's the symbolic world. We just at the title, right? I placed a jar in Tennessee. Okay? Now, so the assertion of human agency, I placed, right? Human agency, human artistry in service of human need. That's pretty good. Human artistry, human agency in service of the most elemental human needs, right? I placed a jar in Tennessee. This instance of beautiful functionality, that's good too. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. So the anecdote begins to take place. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. So there's something about the presence of this jar, its appearance, and what it represents that what? Lends order to the chaos around it. It made that word slovenly, it's a wonderfully chosen word. You don't think of the wilderness nature as slovenly, but in a certain sense, from a certain point of view, which Stevens is exploring, it is, in that it is a kind of disorder with respect to human subjectivity, the understanding, human imagination, human consciousness. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. It lends order to the wilderness. Next stanza. The wilderness rose up to it. So the implication is that it is higher, and it's on the hill, right? So it's higher than wilderness. So wilderness is in a posture of improvement, right? It's in a certain sense, it's admiring the jar. It's in a position of subservience. And sure enough, well, we'll continue. The wilderness rose up to it. So it lends order in its roundness, in its elegance, in its symmetries, in its height. The wilderness rose up to it. This instance of human production, this early instance of human civilization asserting itself. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild, no longer slovenly, no longer wild. And you ask yourself, okay, not only is it giving order to the wilderness, it is no longer wild. What's it doing? It's taming the wilderness. And you start to think, is this entirely a good thing? Is there something that is quote unquote unnatural about this? Is there something negative that's occurring in this anecdote of the jar? An anecdote which is now becoming richer and richer symbolically. You feel that momentum? This kind of the semiotic momentum of the poem builds, right? As simple as the poem could be simpler, right? With the stanzaic construction, couldn't be simpler. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. It tames the wilderness. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall, and of a port in air. Love that phrase. So, and tall, in other words, and of a port in air. That word port, it's very interesting. It's almost an atavistic usage. I mean, it's a usage that would not have obtained anymore in the early 20th century America, in the American language in the early 20th century. But Stevens puts it to use. So of a port, it's the same root as our word important and import. So of a port in air would be proud, and the word portly is exactly related to of a port, right? Proud, portly. The idea is stately. The idea is a little majestic. Proud, portly, stately. So that tall goes with tall, right? Proud, and of a port, portly, stately, of a port in air. And here, air is means it has nothing to do with the actual air around it. What it means, it refers to of a port in air would mean something along the lines of a portly in demeanor or portly in presentation. In other words, if you say there was an air of menace about the place, you don't mean the literal air is menacing. You mean there's in the environment, in the ambience of the place, right? There's a menace. Well, that's the sense of the word air here. So in the presentation, in the ambience around the jar, there's a portliness, a pride, right? The jar was round upon the ground and tall, and of a port in air. Self-important. How about that? I like that because it contains port, right? Self-important. Something a little comical. You know. It took dominion everywhere. That dominion, that word dominion, with its reference, it's kind of an allusion to Genesis. The word dominion is a word that Stevens uses, and we need to keep track of it when it comes up. It took dominion everywhere. And in a certain sense, it's true, isn't it? That the placement of the jar has ordered the wilderness and has tamed the wilderness and rises above the wilderness in its symmetry, in its sense of its own self-importance. It took dominion everywhere. But look at the next line. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee. So it orders the wilderness. This instance of human agency, of human artistry, of human need being elegantly addressed, this instance of the human brings order, which we need, and tames, which we also need. But what can't it give? It doesn't give life. It can't give life. It did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee. It brings order. It brings safety, but it can't bring that most crucial of elements, which fills our world with possibility and meanings. With our living, it can't give life. So it seems to me that the poem exists as a kind of rumination on the role of art and the role of art and the role of human agency in relation to that of nature, as the other of our subjectivity. Let me read that again. The poem becomes a rumination on the role of art and human agency in relation to that of nature as the other of our subjectivity, as that produces the world of otherness, the world of life, beyond our modes of order, beyond our ability to tame it, the against which we define ourselves as human beings in our intercourse with it. You see? And I don't think it makes a, I don't think it makes a claim about who's the winner of this battle. That's not the point. I think the point is that these two elements exist in a perpetual and in an eternal dialogue, in an eternal intercourse, in an eternal tension. And the human animal, if you will, human consciousness inhabits this tension. And these two elements create themselves as we witness on the one hand, and as we walk through, as we inhabit on the other hand. That's pretty good. As we witness and as we inhabit this dynamism, right, between the self and the other that shapes identity via consciousness. Wow, what a great poem. And that's the anecdote. Yeah. Okay. It's great stuff. Let's take a look here then too at another poem as we continue. Where we want to be here. Oops. Sorry. Yeah, here we go. Sorry, page 1, right where it should be. Let's take a look at Wallace Stevens' wonderful poem, A High-Toned Old Christian Woman, 1923 Harmonium. A high-toned old Christian woman. Let me talk a bit about the structure of the poem, because it's a very characteristically Stevens structure. The structure of the poem is at once syllogistic and dialectical. At once syllogistic and dialectical. By syllogistic, I mean it proceeds according to an almost, an almost mathematical sense of logic, right? There's a very lucid and elegantly structured developmental process moving line by line in the poem. Good, and we'll follow that. It's wonderful. So syllogistic and dialectical. What I mean by dialectical is, it's a dialogue. It's a kind of it's a back and forth. It's a kind of call and response between two propositions regarding the nature of human spirituality. And one side of the dialogue, of the dialectic, is the conventionally religious, the theological, if you will. And the other side of the dialogue, the one that Stevens gives voice to, right, is the unconventional spirituality that Stevens associates, as I read in the quote, right, that Stevens associates with human meaning, the generation and maintenance of eternal human meaning, right? That source of meaning which Stevens' poetry opens for us in a way that countervails conventional modes of meaning. And Stevens' work, as I said earlier, it really is scriptural in this sense, right? It makes use of the myths. And we've seen, again, this is something that we've seen again and again in the modernist tradition as we've gone through, right? Writers making use of the culturally mythic. So the structure of the poem is at once syllogistic and dialectical. It's syllogistic in the sense that the poem, first of all, begins with a proposition. Poetry is the supreme fiction matter. So do you see how tendentious that is? That's he's asserting an idea. It's a proposition, right? And it's just like a good 5-paragraph essay. What needs to follow that proposition, that thesis, if you will, is a developmental structure. And that's exactly what we see in the poem. And the poem is in dialectic. And, I'll talk about that today in lecture form, but you'll be able to, after the lecture, you'll be able to see this at work, and you'll be able to work through the structural symmetries of the poem. I mean, you can see them moving back and forth as you go through the poem, and beautifully, and I'll go over this a little bit, but beautifully, the lexical choices, the diction of the poem, the actual word choice of the poem is similarly or identically a participant in this dialectical structure. Okay, so word A used from one point of view is equivalent to word B used from the other point of view. And you can match word A against word B, and you can see the difference, the similarity and the difference. So they're grammatically symmetrical, but they're also symmetrical. They're analogous in the meanings that they bring to each side of this dialectic between the conventionally spiritual and the alternatively spiritual. really cool. You know, it's just, you know, the art of poetry at its best in some ways. It's just it's very beautiful, very beautifully crafted. Okay, so the poem begins with a proposition: poetry is the supreme fiction, madam. So he's talking to the high-toned old Christian woman, high-toned meaning morally superior. Gee, wonder where he got that idea. The morally superior old Christian one. So it's a I don't want to, I'm being a little bit glib here, but just this is a type that all of us have seen. The morally superior woman who is who is self-convinced, utterly self-convinced in her own self-righteousness. That's who Stevens is engaging. But notice, he's not engaging her in a polemic way. He's engaging her in a playful way. And that's the tone of the poem. It's propositional, and what he's proposing really matters. I mean, it really matters, but it's playful in its tone. Nobody can do this like Stevens, right? You do this, you end up sounding dour at times. I love Emily Dickinson, profound favorite. But there's a certain, certain dourness, a certain seriousness there, and appropriately so. Stevens is there's something tongue in cheek all the time with Stevens, always playful. Um, okay, so the poem begins with a proposition. This is the syllogistic quality. Begins with a proposition, and it takes this proposition through the developmental stages of an explicitly argumentative structure. Speaking of Aristotle, right? And third, it arrives, of course, what's going to come next, Damn it, gave it away. I do it in the classroom, I do it over Zoom, damn it. So you have a proposition and a thesis, and then a developmental structure. In a paper, it's paragraph by paragraph. In a short poem, it's line by line. And you could divide the poem if you wanted to. You could separate the lines out, groups of lines, stanzas, groups of lines into the different elements of the poem. It'd be a very instructive thing to do, actually. Separate out the units so you can see how the structure is working. The Aristotelian skeleton that provides order, but is dead. Aristotle. So what Stevens is doing is making the Aristotle skeleton live again with new flesh, new bones, a new spirituality, right? It's actually akin to Aristotle's spirituality. So the proposition is put through developmental stages. There's an explicitly argumentative structure, and you arrive, third, at a conclusion regarding the issue. And fourth, the poem discusses the implications of this conclusion. Okay? So that's why it's syllogistic. Now it's dialectical. It sounds like a fancy word, but actually it's related to our word dialogue, our word dialect, and the word lecture, L-E-C-T, that's the same root, and our word lectern, it's related to the word for reading. It's a Latin and Greek root. So the poem's dialectical in that the poem proposes the positions of two opposing, look at line 7, right? Look at line 7, opposing principles, right? So quote unquote opposing principles, opposing ideas, and consider, well, let me just read this again. The poem juxtaposes the positions of two opposing ideas, opposing in quotes, and considers their implications. Okay, so let's begin. Let me see how we're doing on time. Okay. The poem describes two fictive impulses, right? In conventional terms, the creation of narrative myth is called religion, okay? The fictive impulse of religion, fictive in the sense that it's making something, right? And the other fictive impulse is the supreme fiction that's alluded to in the first line of in the title of the poem, or I should say the first line of the poem, and that narrative myth, that fictive narrative myth is for Stevens the supreme fiction. So it's essentially it's conventional religion versus the supreme fiction of poetry, right? And obviously, where Stevens is going to hang his hat in that argument, right? But elegantly and with the open spirit. So you have these two fictive. The poem describes two fictive impulses, which, though opposing in line 7 in their perspectives, are parallel, quote unquote, in principle. Look at line 6. Parallel, quote unquote, in principle. That is, they're parallel in their intentions to construct a narrative mythology which accomplishes 3 ends. First of all, it identifies the features of consciousness which are most richly and definitively human. Secondly, it builds ritual forms around these crucial features. And third, it expresses through these ritual forms our yearning for the possibility of a beauty and rightness uncompromised by temporality, uncompromised by time and place. That is, that's those ritual forms are, as I said before, religion and poetry, right? Two fictive impulses that create a beauty, or that aspire to create a beauty and rightness that are eternal. So the poem identifies the respective parallel logics, of these two fictive impulses, these two myth-making, these two mythological impulses, through their differing premises, their differing values, their differing developmental processes, their differing implications. The poem establishes the legitimacy of both. It's very important we realize that, right? It establishes the legitimacy of both, and it follows that legitimacy to its logical conclusion. So let's look at the parallel terms of this comparison of mythologies. Let's just actually look at the actual language of the poem, right? On the one hand, you have the Christian system, essentially a culture of moral restraint, right? And on the other hand, you have poetry, which for Stevens is a kind of Dionysiac, as in Dionysus, right? A kind of Dionysiac or Dionysian fiction, which is essentially a culture of release. So on the one hand, you have a culture of restraint, moral restraint. On the other hand, you have a culture of moral release. So on the one hand, you have the word moral law, right? Look at the second line. Take the moral law and make a knave of it. All right, let's read the poem here. Let me invoke the poem. Take the moral law. So poetry is the supreme fiction matter. Argument begins. Take the moral law and make a knave of it. Knave in a church, N-A-V-E, right? Part of the church that the pews and the aisle constitute. That's what the nave is. Now, this is funny too, because the word knave sounds exactly like the Shakespearean, the Elizabethan word K-N-A-V-E, knave, which means fool. So there's something teasing at the very beginning, Here, what you're doing, lady, is you're taking the moral law and you're making a knave of it. You're building a church around it, around that moral law, but you're also making a fool of the moral law. So there's that, there's that teasing quality. Take the moral law and make a knave of it. And from the knave, build a haunted heaven. You take the moral law, the commandment, thou shalt not, right? build a church around it, a physical structure, and an idea of the eternal, a haunted heaven, haunted because there's a guy with a white dude with a big beard sitting up there in big Aristotelian robes, trying to give you the cliche, right? And build a haunted heaven, an idea of the eternal. Thus, in the way that you've demonstrated, right? The conscience, the source of the moral law, right, is converted into palms. I love that, palms. It's because you think of palms, and you also think of those long fronds that were placed in front of the man Jesus as he came into town on the donkey, right? That the palms, that which we lay before that principle of holiness, that principle of eternal life, that principle of moral possibility, that we lay down before that principle to acknowledge its power, to acknowledge its sacredness, right? The conscience is converted into palms. These palms to prayer. Like windy citherns, hankering for hymns. Okay, citherns, right? You can look. I'm sure you know what citherns are, but if you don't, there's a footnote. And hymns, that is the holy music of this tradition, the hymn, the art that's produced by this conventional spiritual investigation, this conventional spiritual institution, this conventional spiritual construction. Okay, so Stevens lays out the logic of it. And he says, I love this line 6, we agree in principle. So, in other words, I can do exactly what you can do. And we're on parallel paths here. You see? So he's establishing a kind of equity, a kind of dialogue, a kind of dialectic, right? We agree in principle. I'm not disagreeing with you. We're on parallel tracks here. We agree in principle. That's clear. But, okay, there's the paragraph break, right? In this Aristotelian structure, in this dialectic. I should say in the syllogistic quality, right? And it's the other side of the dialectic in that syllogistic, call and response kind of structure. That's clear. We agree in principle, that's true. But take the opposing law as opposed to the moral law. Now, what would the opposing law be as opposed to the law of restraint, moral restraint? Thou shalt not. The law would be, thou shalt do it, right? Explore. Don't hold back. Explore. In this part of the poem, I always think of Odysseus tied to the mast. He ties himself to the mast, but he leaves his ears unstoppered so he can have the world, as well as exercise moral restraint. And so what Stevens is doing here, see y'all, is asserting the other side of the equation, right? You have the moral law, yes, thou shalt not, but you also, madam, have to recognize thou shalt in your life and the holiness of thou shalt. But take the opposing law and make it peristyle. So look at peristyle is grammatically parallel to knave, right? And peristyle is the pagan nave, right? It's the system of columns that goes around the Greek temple, right? The pagan temple. Make a peristyle, and from the peristyle, just like parallel to from the nave, see the grammatical parallelisms. From the peristyle, project the mask beyond the planets. A mask is a theatrical event, right? Produce an act of theater, produce a dance, produce a form of artistic expression. project a mask beyond the planets. Thus, and here's the thus that's parallel to the earlier thus in the third line of the poem, right? So the logical developmental structure continues. Thus, our bodiness, that is as opposed to conscience. So bodiness is parallel to conscience in the grammar of the poem, in the structure of the poem, you see? So there's the dialectic, producing itself grammatically, as well as in terms of the lexically, grammatically as well as lexically. You see? And a logic is unspooling. Thus, our bodiness, unpurged by epitaph, indulged at last, is equally, just like yours, just as powerfully as yours, is converted into palms, comma. Well, what kind of, the other kind of palms were the fronds that you lay in front of the man Jesus, right? The other kind of palms were the palms in prayer, right? And look at these palms though, equally converted into palms, squiggling like saxophones. So these palms are the hands of the sax player running up and down the saxophone, the hands of the people dancing the Lindy Hop, dancing the various dances of 1923, and their ebullient and effervescent motions, right? Those palms, the palms of release, the palms of enthusiasm, the palms of joy, jazz palms. I'm trying not to use the expression jazz hands. Okay, and palm for palm, madam, we are where we began. You and I engaging each other in a kind of spiritual dialogue in which I recognize the legitimacy of the structures you have made, but you got to recognize the legitimacy of mine. And that's what you're not doing. You see that? That's the argument, right? Okay. And I love this. So there's another paragraph break in our developmental structure. Allow, therefore, so you must notice allow, an imperative. It's in the imperative mood. It's not the indicative, it's not the subjunctive, it's the imperative. Allow, you gotta do this, madam. I've proven it to you, right? Allow, therefore, I love the therefore, totally syllogistic, right? And here's the conclusion. Allow, therefore, you gotta allow, therefore, based on the logic that I just placed in front of you, allow that in the planetary scene, your cosmology, you know, in the planetary scene, in the universal, the scenarios of universal meaning you've constructed, allow in that planetary scene your disaffected flagellance. That is, you know, yeah, okay, you have the real flagellance. The people, remember the medieval flagellants or flagellants who whip themselves to remind them of the imperfections and flaws and sinful nature of the flesh, right? Medieval Christianity. Allow your disaffected flagellants. That is, people that aren't going to, they're flagellants, but they're not your kind of flagellants. Well stuffed, not skinny, but well stuffed, smacking their muzzy bellies in parade. Again, it's turning into New Orleans, isn't it? Smacking their muzzy bellies in parade, you know, having just had some beers and having just had a po' boy sandwich dressed, and having just decided to get up from the table and go join the second line that's moving down Canal Street, right? Proud, smacking their muzzy bellies in parade, proud, not ashamed, but proud of such novelties of the sublime, such, and here the jazz percussion comes in, such tink and tank and tunk-a-tunk tunk, such this music of rhythm, the music that sounds pagan, a music that sounds less refined than your hymns, right? So here's Stevens' equivalent of the hymn, right? Structurally. Allow such tink and tank and tunk-a-tunk tunk, allow that they may, merely these flagellants, these disaffected flagellants, may merely You don't have to, but you can. You have to admit, we may, merely may, madam, whip from themselves a jovial hullabaloo among the spheres, right? As opposed to the windy cithern hankering for hymns. What Stevens is advocating for is that jazz, joyful hullabaloo among the spheres, a spirituality based on release as opposed to restraint, a spiritually based on joy as opposed to moral rectitude, right? He's asserting the both sides of the coin, right? And then the great last lines. This will make widows wince, but fictive things wink as they will. Wink most when widows wince. This will make widows wince. Fictive things wink as they will. Wink most when widows wince. Okay, just give you a little language on that. This will make widows wince. That is, to see denial, aesthetic denial, the culture of thou shalt not. To see denial being flouted in this way, flouted by these disaffected flagellants smacking their muzzy bellies in parade, to see denial being flouted in this way and sensuality being proudly celebrated in this way will offend those who have lived by the denial of sensuality. Next line. But fictive things wink as they will. My translation. But the myths which express our humanity playfully ignore those who would suppress them. Madam, right? The myths which express our humanity playfully ignore those who would suppress them. Fictive things wink as they will, wink most when widows wince. In fact, their playful mockery of this culture of denial increases the more denial is offended by their joy. Let me repeat that. So weak most when widows wince. In fact, their playful mockery of this culture of denial increases the more denial is offended by their joy. So the ultimate message of the poem is this. First of all, that in our cultural mythologies, our religions, our poetries, the joys of the sensual must be celebrated with as much passion as the admonitions of the conscience. Let me give that to you again. In our cultural mythologies, our religions, our poetries, the two halves of the dialectic, the joys of the sensual must be celebrated with as much passion as the admonitions of the conscience. And secondly, the poem proposes that exuberance and indulgence are as important to the human experience as restraint and denial. Proposes that exuberance and indulgence are as important to the human experience as restraint and denial. Well, I have a jazz song all hooked up for you as usual, but I am afraid I'm going to fail to play it for you, simply because we've gone too long. Thanks, everybody.